listener production.
Hello, Sasha Barber-Gatt with you. Welcome to The Briefing. There have been questions recently about how to unite Australians, and as people across the country clash today over what January 26 should be, there's no doubt that displays of patriotism all year round are being viewed differently than they were even just a couple of decades ago. So is patriotism just cringy now? And should we be finding a way to show pride in our country? That chat is coming up in today's Deep Dive. But first, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spyrou on Monday, the 26th of January.
I wish you all a happy Australia Day.
Morning, Sash, and Anthony Albanese, who you just heard there in his Australia Day message as the country marks what has become the most divisive days in our calendar. Despite that, the Prime Minister has urged Australians to unite and have faith in each other in his address to the nation today.
Whilst this summer has tested our nation once again, as ever, in the worst of times we have seen the very best of the Australian character. Let us look to the year ahead, united by pride in our country and faith in each other.
As part of the annual holidays tradition, the Australian of the Year was announced last night, with astronaut Catherine Bennell-Pegg named this year's winner.
As a kid, I used to lie on the dry grass in my backyard and gaze up at the stars in awe.
The space engineer became the first person to qualify as an astronaut under the Australian flag after graduating from a European Space Agency astronaut program all the way back in 2024. I say all the way back, but that was only 2 years ago, really.
Yeah, look, not that long ago, Chris. In fact, probably just 1 year ago. Ned Brockman, meantime, took out the Young Australian of the Year, and you might have seen his efforts fundraising for homelessness services by doing insane runs, including running from one side of Australia to the other in 47 days. Dementia prevention researcher Professor Henry Broderty was named the Senior Australian of the Year, while Kathy Freeman topped the Australia Day honours list. Now, also on that roundup, Julie Inman-Grant, the E-Safety Commissioner, she was recognised for her work in establishing our world-first social media ban. And Midnight Oils' Rob Hurst, who died last week, he was recognised for his service to the performing arts.
Yeah, and events will be taking place right around the country today to mark Australia Day, including the traditional citizenship ceremony in Canberra, which the PM will attend. But while it's a day of celebration for some, for others it's a day of mourning, with every capital city to see Invasion Day rallies today. Tens of thousands of people are expected to turn out to events in Sydney and Melbourne alone. Police are on high alert in those spots, with March for Australia events also planned, sparking concern that protesters could clash today.
To Queensland now, where authorities have started the process of euthanising the dingoes involved in the death of Canadian backpacker Piper James. The 19-year-old's body was found last Monday on Gari's eastern beach, surrounded by a pack of approximately 10 dingoes, with an autopsy finding she had been bitten by the animals before she died, but drowning was the most likely cause of death.
Authorities say 6 of the dingoes have already been put down, with more in the coming days, describing it as a tough decision, but one made based on evidence and in the interest of public safety. While there are no plans to cull more dingoes beyond the pack identified, the island's dingo management strategy will be reviewed.
Yeah, something interesting that's come out of this, Chris, is the traditional owners of Gari expressing their anger that they actually weren't consulted on any of this. They claim they were kept out of the loop. And Gari is a national park owned through native title by the Butchulla people. They co-manage the island in collaboration with the state government, and they actually hold a deep ancestral and spiritual connection to the island's dingoes, whom they call Wangari. Now, the Butchulla Aboriginal Corporation Secretary says they were not consulted on the decision to euthanise these dingoes. They weren't even told about it until the first 6 had been killed. And they say that this government has no respect for First Nations people. It's a disgrace. So maybe a lesson there in how, the state government should be collaborating with First Nations people when these issues are coming up, especially when it comes to the dingoes who they hold that close spiritual and ancestral connection with. I also want to pivot just quickly and talk about, animal management in another state, in New South Wales. We have been told that they're going to increase the amount of drones that are flying over beaches and also start tagging more bull sharks, of course, in response to those 4 recent shark attacks in the state. And sadly, over the weekend, we saw that 12-year-old Nico Antic died from his injuries. The young boy is 12 and he was attacked while he was swimming in one of Sydney's harbour beaches. So that was really sad to see over the weekend as well.
Overseas now into the US, where there are growing calls for the Trump administration to conduct a full and transparent investigation after a second person was shot and killed by ICE agents in Minneapolis. 37-year-old US citizen and ICU nurse Alex Preddy was shot dead by federal immigration officers over the weekend. Authorities say the ICE agents were conducting a targeted operation against an illegal immigrant when they were approached by Preddy. Footage shows him filming the agents before he's sprayed with pepper spray and wrestled to the ground by a number of them. One agent is then seen drawing their weapon. Multiple gunshots are heard shortly after, and a warning, this audio is distressing.
The head of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, has spoken, and she's labelled Preddy a domestic terrorist, claiming agents were acting in self-defence.
This individual showed up to a law enforcement operation with a weapon and dozens of rounds of ammunition.
It's worth noting, though, that the footage doesn't actually show Preddy holding a gun. And it's interesting, Chris, we also saw this in the wake of the Renee Good shooting. She was the woman who was killed only just a couple of weeks ago in the same city by ICE agents, is that news organisations are actually taking the footage and getting experts to break it down and piece it together, because there's this distrust in what Kristi Noem and what the White House is telling the people when they're saying that, oh, well, this was the situation and our agents were acting completely within their remit. News agencies like CNN are actually going, we've broken this down and this is what we've seen based on this expert's knowledge. So it's been news agencies that have actually been breaking down this footage and saying, well, no, we can't actually see him holding a gun in this. What we do see, though, is an officer reaching to the nurse's lower back and stepping away with what does appear to be pistol. He is then shot to death. So questions will persist. Protests have broken out once again in response to this, and tensions are obviously extremely high in Minneapolis at the moment.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is we do know that Kristi Noem, she'll be leading the Homeland investigation into this. This is her world. This is her, head of power. But there are calls for it to escalate and elevate way above that, because based on the way that she's speaking about it, there is this doubt that she will be able to lead a meaningful and truthful investigation instead of just covering for agents there. And that's a call that's coming from all sides of politics in the US at the moment. There are Republicans, there are Democrats calling for this. Interestingly, this morning we heard from the NRA, so that's the National Rifle Association. These are longtime Trump supporters or Republican supporters. To hear them calling for an investigation this morning is very interesting.
Back home now, millions of Aussies will be hit with scorching temperatures this week as heat waves hit the southeast of the country. Of the biggest concern today is Victoria, where a number of bushfires continue to burn, most sparked by the last heat wave the state saw, which was just a couple of weeks back in the first week of January.
Temperatures will remain warm but fairly mild in places like Melbourne today, maxing out at 30 degrees, but climbing up to a whopping 44 degrees tomorrow. While locations in the north and west of the state are set to see blistering heat with a week of 40-plus temps, Mildura in the northwest is tipped to hit 48 degrees tomorrow.
Authorities across the state are bracing for horrific bushfire conditions with this run of weather, not seen since the lead up to the devastating Black Saturday fires way back in 2009. Meantime, Australia Day events in Adelaide have been cancelled today with a top temp of 45 degrees expected. It's just insane to see these temps, Chris, but I mean, it's starting to feel more normal. I was having this thought over the weekend, right? So long-range forecasts are predicting hotter than average days until April for much of the country. And that word, hotter than average, when is the average going to shift? Because surely it's soon, because every time the BOM puts out a long-range forecast, they say hotter than average expected. So surely the average is about to switch.
An absolute demolition by the Demon, and he is through to the quarterfinals.
And we wrap up today's headlines with that audio from 9 of homegrown hopeful Alex De Minaur's win at the Australian Open, sending him through to the quarters. He beat Alexander Bublik in just 92 minutes. The Kazakhstani getting flustered in the 6-4, 6-1, 6-1 demolition.
I need to hit, but how can I hit? It's a ping pong ball. It doesn't fly. It's the slowest court I ever played in my
Thank you. Well, it was time to listen in there, and apologies for a little bit of the language.
And that audio thanks to 9 as well. The Demons win sets up a mouth-watering clash with top seed Carlos Alcaraz tomorrow.
Yeah, the Spaniard winning through yesterday, along with Aryna Sabalenka, Coco Gauff, Alexander Zverev and Elina Svitolina. In action today, we've got Aussie Madison Inglis, who will also be hoping to book a spot in the quarters, but she does have quite a tough ask, Chris, facing off against Iga Swiatek. Yannick Sinner, Taylor Fritz and Madison Keys are some of the other big names in action today. I want to point out, though, we were just talking about the weather. It's going to be 44 degrees at Melbourne Park tomorrow. They haven't released what time the games are happening yet, but they're almost definitely going to have to take the weather into consideration. They can't have players out on centre court in the middle of the day when it's 40 plus temps. So, yeah, I mean, typical of the Oz Open, though, there's always at least one heat-affected day, right?
There's a ball boy or a ball girl that, faints from the heat as well. It's horrible.
They had that last
to see.
week.
Yeah.
It was awful. But, yeah, that is it for our headlines today. If you are here on the public holiday, well done. You're obviously up having a hot girl walk or something like that. Or maybe you're at work like we are. Thank you for joining us. Next up, we are getting into a deep dive looking at patriotism, what it means in 2026, whether we should be patriotic. Is it just cringy? Chris, it was a really interesting chat. It was yours, and it's up next.
I want to start today's deep dive by asking you a hypothetical question. If you were to see me standing on the street today with a Southern Cross tattooed on my cheek, proudly waving an Australian flag, what assumptions would you make about me? There's a decent chance your first thought might have been, that's pretty cringy. And depending on your worldview, you might have thought some other things about me too. Maybe that I'm a bit of a weirdo, maybe that I'm a racist. In our current political and cultural climate, overt patriotism is often viewed as something to avoid or even be embarrassed by. But if you go back even just 20 years, you couldn't walk down the street on Australia Day without seeing Aussie flags and Southern Crosses in every direction. Every council held a citizenship ceremony, almost every pub put on specials and live music. People would flock to parks and beaches to celebrate and be patriotic. And that national pride wasn't just limited to January 26. Now though, the idea of proudly waving an Aussie flag is at best cringy to a lot of people and racist at worst. So how exactly did we get here? What role has our colonial past and problematic policies played in it? And is it time we rethink how we express our patriotism in this country? Dr. Benjamin Jones is a senior lecturer of history at Central Queensland Uni and he joins me now. Dr. Ben, welcome to the briefing. To start us off, what is patriotism and what are some examples of how it can be shown?
Nationalism and patriotism tend to be two sides of a coin. They're both tied to having a love and a passion for your country. Historically, nationalism, sometimes with adjectives like strident nationalism or strong nationalism, tends to be tied to xenophobia, sometimes racism, sometimes military aggression, and the idea that our nation is superior. And it's almost universally used in a negative sense. Patriotism can be seen as the other side of that coin. It still draws on a love of your country and a sense of community and a sense of not just being individuals, but also having an investment in community and in other people who share the country with you. But patriotism, while sometimes is also used as a derogative term if people display it in different ways, I think patriotism, generally speaking, can be a positive expression of your love of country in wanting to build it and learn about it and to contribute towards it.
In terms of how patriotism's been expressed here in Australia, how has that exactly changed over the years?
Yeah, well, Australia is quite unique in that expressions of patriotism have changed so radically since Federation in 1901 that it's basically unrecognisable. So 1901, Australians considered themselves, or at least the majority white Australians, considered themselves to be British Australians. Every school would have this famous map of the world with pink bits coloured in of all the different countries that make up the British Empire. Australia Day didn't exist when Australia started, so the main national holiday was 24 of May for Empire Day. There was certainly pride in being Australian, but you could think of it as Australia almost being a state and the British Empire being the country. That's what drove Australians to volunteer in enormous numbers for World War I in particular. And then somewhere in the 60s and 70s, you have this period of decolonisation around the world and empires, especially European empires, devolving. You have the British Empire ends and Australia is left saying, well, what's left? If we're not British Australians, we're just Australians. And then there was this rush to reinvent patriotism. And this is where changing the anthem from God Save the Queen, as it was then, to Advance Australia Fair became important. There was discussions about changing the flag. So you have this gradual move away from British Australian to just Australian. So I'd say that's been the main change in Australian patriotism over the last century.
You mentioned the 60s there, and when I think about the 60s, I think about the wave of migration and, the way that Australia's cultural character started to shift with a lot of migrants coming from Europe, my grandparents and dad included in that. How did the idea of patriotism in Australia shift with that? Because, like you mentioned, we're no longer tethered to the UK all that much, and then we have this mix of cultures. What did it mean to be an Australian and proud Australian at that?
That's a great question. And the 60s and 70s were particularly interesting decades in that you also have the slow death of the White Australia policy. And Australians were starting to, at least some Australians were starting to get a bit embarrassed and say that we're beginning to stand out as a racist nation here by having this concern in our immigration policy. And so particularly in the 70s, the last remnants of White Australia were completely removed, and the immigration minister, Al Grassby, famously said, White Australia is dead, give me a shovel and I'll bury it. But the real test, it's one thing to change the legislation, it's another thing to actually see on the street that the demographics and what an Australian looks like starting to change. And after the Vietnam War in particular, large numbers of Vietnamese refugees were allowed into Australia. And I think that's when you really started to see a shift in what the typical, or perhaps the idea that there is no typical Australian. And so we're become united under ideas, I suppose, of democracy, the rule of law, and even cultural things like the supposed laid-back Australian lifestyle starts to be the uniting things to be patriotic about rather than these ideas of race.
If we were to fast forward a few more decades, we can move ourselves now to 2005, the Cronulla riots of 2005. How did our government reconcile this idea that we were trying to kill, or we did kill from a policy perspective, White Australia policy, and we were shoving that all the way to the side? And then we have this flashpoint, we have this major event happen. How did that start to shake up and change the national conversation, at least from a political perspective?
Yeah, it was definitely one of the dark periods in Australian history. And I think it revealed how easy it is to stoke fear about immigration. And to an extent, I think some Australians who still liked the idea of being a largely homogenous nation, they stopped using the word white, but they certainly would dog whistle sometimes by just using terms like we're against immigration. And to an extent, that has become a dividing line, I suppose, of conservative and progressive politics. And it also shows, I suppose, how easy it is sometimes to stoke some of those flames.
In your opinion, do you think from that day forward, the Australian flag started to be misused, or perhaps what the Australian flag represented was challenged from that point forward? Because I do think about, in that time, flags were everywhere. People were flying them in the front of their homes. It was quite common to see someone with a Southern Cross tattoo. It felt as we moved into the 2010s, that started to dwindle down a little bit. And nowadays, the flag starts, or if you're waving a flag, you're painted with a different brush. Do you think that was a turning point in Australian history, and what these general symbols of patriotism started to mean shifted?
You could be right. Certainly the Southern Cross tattoo, which used to be one of the most popular tattoos to get, stopped being seen just as a symbol of patriotism and attachment to Australia, and particularly after 2005 also had these connotations of a kind of aggressive, potentially violent, and I suppose most concerningly and kind of upsettingly as well, because you would like to think that national symbols can be neutral and can be used no matter where you sit on the political spectrum. But I think Southern Cross tattoos especially came to be seen as some kind of right-wing insignia and an indication that you're on that side of the political fence. The flag itself is a strange one because this is another element of Australia's colonial era or Dominion era past. And I often compare it to Canada, where they have a similar trajectory and then in the 60s say, well, it's no longer appropriate to have a big Union Jack in the top left as they used to do. And having this unambiguous symbol, the maple leaf, the red and white, people instantly think of Canada. So Paul Keating was making that argument in the 90s that it's well and truly time for Australia to adopt a new flag. And it wasn't out of any particular disrespect to history or anything like that, but he was just pointing out that great countries and confident countries, in his opinion, don't have the flag of another country.
Bringing it back to this idea of patriotism and, the idea that it is cringy to be patriotic present day, do you think changing something like the date would help us reconcile these feelings, these icky feelings that we do have with patriotism?
I'm not sure I agree that patriotism is cringy. I think there's always going to be different opinions on it, but I think there are a lot of young Australians who take a lot of pride in their country and do things like the Kokoda Trail, or will go over to Gallipoli to see a dawn service. And I think there's always a diversity of views. I think there's a particular brand of patriotism, I suppose, that people, if it seems like it's politicized, some of the March for Australia's where even if you like the flag, almost seemed going kind of over the top, and especially bringing in the red ensign as well as the current flag seems to have quite a political meaning. But patriotism itself, I think there'll always be a diversity of views. But in terms of changing Australia Day, I suppose the question is just, well, what are we celebrating? Because if we're celebrating Australia, then it does seem strange to choose the date that British colonisation started.
I do want to ask you, Ben, before we let you go, that point you made about patriotism not being cringy when done in certain contexts, I take that on board. And I wonder if the question is rather, has patriotism just evolved beyond waving flags and gathering in your bucket hats and with your face tattoos on Australia Day? Does patriotism just look different in 2026?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think most Australians would agree that meaningful patriotism is donating blood, for instance. And in the wake of the Bondi massacre, the Red Cross reported there was a huge increase in people donating blood. Things like Clean Up Australia Day, anything that connects you with community in a practical, real way that shows that you're tied into your community, that you're invested in your fellow Australians. I think that's what real patriotism looks like, rather than how many flags or tattoos you have.
Ben, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That was Dr. Benjamin Jones, Senior Lecturer of History at Central Queensland Uni, speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. I'm Chris Spyrou. I'll catch you next time.